it does seem kind of a puzzle why these new ideas about freedom, called Enlightenment ideas, began to develop within Europe and the United States. It is difficult to know how they developed because the world did not seem to change very much at the time. So, since Europe and the United States still had an agriculture base, it was strange that people began to naturally seem to believe that they needed to control their own freedom and that this was the ideal, this personal liberty and rights that needed to be protected against governments. There are likely two sources for this new thinking about freedom. We will only focus on one right now. It does seem as though the American source for thinking about freedom and the European source are perhaps a little different, but we'll focus on the European source about thinking about freedom, this idea of enlightenment, that a person needs the courage to trust his or her own understanding and not rely on any outside authority. What began to happen before the French Revolution of 1789 was so much international travel by boat for purposes of trade, for discovery, and a lot of the major European countries were traveling during this time. Well, in 1644, another group of French began to travel to what was called the New World, the Americas, and their purpose was mainly to spread religion. What happened is they came in contact with a group of Native Americans or indigenous people called the Wendat, and a lot of the information about this contact between the French missionaries here in 1644 and the indigenous people called the Wendat was preserved in a document written by a French aristocrat. And it's written in the form of a dialogue between him and another person among the Wendat whose name was supposed to be Candiaronk. This is the indigenous name. This document that survives from the 17th century that preserves the conversation has large parts where Candiaronk is justifying the natural freedoms that the Native American people have that the French do not have. So a lot of this document is a record about a kind of argument they were having. For example, Candiaronk is asking the French aristocrat, why do you have this big difference between rich and poor people? Why do you have this idea about a higher class and a lower class? why can't people freely live as they want? Now, it has been hypothesized from different sources, among them David Graeber and David Wingrove, but also by another man, Michael's the Savage, I think it's his, no, David's the Savage, here on the shelf, in the book The Decline and Rise of Democracy. And various other sources have hypothesized that this kind of contact spread ideas of freedom into Europe. So, ironically, a lot of these ideas of freedom, the Enlightenment ideas, might have gotten their origin from this contact between the Native American groups that were contacted and the Europeans. Maybe specifically in this case, the French and the Wendat people. That's one hypothesis. And if so, it would make sense, because then this idea about freedom and enlightenment is not just theory. The European people are beginning to believe this because they are seeing what it looks like to live freely in the New World. So, to try to answer the question, why in the 1780s, when Europe is still mostly run by kings and nobles and is a mostly agricultural society, why all of a sudden would these ideas about freedom come? Well, one reasonable hypothesis is when some Europeans made contact with indigenous people in the New World, they began to spread those ideas to Europe, and they also got to see what it looks like to live freely, and then think about the possibility that they could live this freely as well.